They said it looked like a coffin carved by the devil himself, a hollow iron woman whose serene face curved into a faint smile. When her doors closed, that smile became your last reflection. Inside, hundreds of spikes waited, not long enough to kill instantly, just deep enough to make you bleed slowly, whispering your confessions into steel. They called it the Iron Maiden, a masterpiece of medieval cruelty, a machine so infamous it became the very symbol of human evil. But what if I told you it never truly existed? What if the Iron Maiden, the smiling coffin of nightmares, wasn't a medieval weapon of faith, but a modern invention of fear? Tonight, we'll uncover how a lie about pain became more powerful than the truth, and how humanity's fascination with torture didn't die with the Middle Ages. It just changed its face. For centuries, the Iron Maiden has haunted our collective imagination, the perfect symbol of medieval sadism. A coffin-shaped sarcophagus lined with cold iron spikes, standing silently in the corners of dark museums, whispering of faith gone mad. It's the image that comes to mind whenever someone says the Dark Ages, priests chanting, torches flickering, a prisoner screaming inside that metal shell. It feels ancient. It feels authentic. But the truth is far stranger and far more disturbing. Because the Iron Maiden wasn't born in the Middle Ages at all. It was born in an age of science, reason, and enlightenment. An age that claimed to have outgrown barbarity, yet couldn't stop obsessing over it. The first recorded Iron Maiden didn't appear until the late 1700s in the German city of Nuremberg. Not in the 1300s, not in the 1400s, but in the same century that gave us electricity, telescopes, and the French Revolution. That's right, this machine of medieval torture was actually a modern invention, a product of imagination, not inquisition. It wasn't built to punish heretics. It was built to shock tourists. The story begins with Johann Philipp Siebenkees, a Nuremberg scholar and showman. He was the first to describe an Iron Maiden in 1793, claiming it had been used centuries earlier to execute a coin counterfeiter. His story was dramatic, detailed, and completely fabricated. No court records, no eyewitnesses, no physical device. Just one man's tale told to impress visitors in a museum of horrors. Yet people believed him. Because they wanted to. In an era obsessed with reason, there was something intoxicating about imagining a past ruled by madness. Enlightened Europe wanted to see itself as civilized, modern, humane, and to do that, it needed to invent a dark age to look down upon. The Iron Maiden was perfect propaganda, a convenient lie that made the present look pure. Siebenkees' story spread like wildfire. Within a few decades, replicas appeared in wax museums and traveling exhibitions across Europe. Each was more gruesome than the last, taller, bloodier, more ornate. Some were built with hinged doors that creaked open to reveal spikes painted red with fake blood. Others were sculpted with serene female faces, the smile of false mercy. They weren't historical artifacts. They were stage props. And yet, by the late 19th century, people had come to believe these props were genuine relics of medieval horror. Here's the irony. The so-called Age of Enlightenment created one of history's darkest myths. While philosophers debated morality and scientists mapped the stars, ordinary people were paying tickets to watch reenactments of imaginary torture. It wasn't the Middle Ages that glorified pain. It was modernity. And that's the part that makes the Iron Maiden so unsettling. Because it isn't really a story about medieval cruelty. It's a story about our own fascination with cruelty. How easily we turn horror into spectacle. How readily we believe the worst about the past so we can feel better about ourselves. The Iron Maiden didn't crawl out of a dungeon. It was assembled in the daylight. One lie, one rumor, one exhibition at a time. But the legend didn't stop with Siebenkees. Once the myth was born, it began to evolve. Historians, curators, and politicians found new uses for it, each adding their own layer of fear, morality, and control. The Iron Maiden was about to become more than a fake device. It would become an idea, a reflection of everything people feared about faith, power, and themselves. And that's where the nightmare truly begins. Imagine standing before it, a towering iron sarcophagus, almost human in shape, its surface mottled by rust and shadow. Two doors curved like shoulders and hips, sculpted with the faint outline of a woman's face. Her eyes are closed, her lips parted in a soft, almost pitying smile. She looks calm, merciful, until you notice what waits inside her. The doors creak open. Metal groans. The air smells of oil and dust and age. Within the hollow body glint dozens, no hundreds, of spikes, each one precisely positioned. At the chest, the stomach, the groin, the eyes. Not to impale all at once, but to pierce just enough to keep the victim breathing. Just enough to turn dying into performance. That's the genius of the Iron Maiden's design, whether imagined or real. It wasn't a device for efficiency. It was a device for drama. Every detail told a story. The maternal shape promised comfort. The spikes betrayed that promise. The face smiled while killing. It was cruelty disguised as compassion. For those who saw it in the 18th and 19th centuries, the Iron Maiden wasn't simply an artifact. It was a mirror. A perfect embodiment of their fears about faith, authority, and the dark recesses of the human soul. It whispered, "This is what blind belief looks like." It smiled, "This is what mercy feels like when power controls it." Psychologists today might call it projection through horror, the process of externalizing what we fear inside ourselves. The Enlightenment public, so proud of their progress, projected their buried barbarity onto the ignorant Middle Ages. They needed the Iron Maiden to prove they were better, to believe that cruelty belonged to another time. But it didn't. They were still feeding off it. Only now they did it through spectacle, not execution. Look closely at the symbolic architecture of the device. The outer shell, sanctified femininity, almost Virgin Mary, like evoking protection and purity. The interior, hidden violence, male-dominated punishment masked by the body of a woman. It is both womb and tomb, birth twisted into death. That contradiction made it unforgettable. Audiences couldn't look away because the Iron Maiden embodied everything humans secretly crave to understand: pain, guilt, and justice. Even its supposed function was designed to heighten imagination. Spikes too short to pierce the heart, too shallow to kill instantly, enough to puncture skin, burst veins, and bleed out slowly, while still allowing confession between gasps. To those who stared at the replica in Nuremberg or London, that slow death was almost sacred, a ritual of purification through agony. It was torture transformed into morality theater. And that's why the Iron Maiden became so powerful. It didn't need to be real. It needed only to feel real. It lived in the space between horror and belief, the exact place where myths thrive. Once an audience could imagine the pain, it no longer mattered whether anyone had truly suffered inside it. The image itself did the work. A face of iron, a hollow body, a smile frozen in mock sympathy. That was enough to make people's skin crawl. There's something deeply human about that. Our brains react to imagined pain as if it were happening to us. That's why stories of torture captivate, why we flinch even when we know it's fiction. Fear is empathy turned inside out. We feel for the victim, but we also savor the safety of being the observer. That delicate tension, horror mixed with relief, is the secret formula behind every torture myth in history. And so the Iron Maiden endured not because anyone used it, but because everyone could picture using it. Collectors displayed it. Writers romanticized it. Audiences whispered about it. Each retelling sharpened its spikes, deepened its smile. By the time it appeared in museum catalogs, it had already achieved immortality. Not as an object of metal, but as an idea, fear refined into art. The anatomy of the Iron Maiden isn't mechanical. It's psychological. Every hinge, every spike, every metallic whisper was built from imagination, stitched together from guilt, pride, and the desperate need to believe that cruelty ended when civilization began. But history has a cruel sense of irony, because the Iron Maiden's myth would soon escape the museums that birthed it and step into the hands of those who could make its fiction real. The 18th century called itself the Age of Enlightenment. the era of reason, science, and progress. Philosophers wrote about liberty, equality, and the rights of man. Pain, they said, belonged to the past. But in the same parlors where people toasted human progress, they were also paying money to stare at Iron Maidens, racks, and guillotines. That's the paradox at the heart of modern civilization. The more we claim to outgrow cruelty, the more obsessed we become with looking back at it. When Johann Philipp Siebenkees invented his story of the Nuremberg Iron Maiden, he wasn't writing a history. He was writing propaganda for the present. His tale painted medieval Europe as a continent ruled by superstition and brutality, a world where religion sanctioned pain and reason was a distant dream. It was a convenient contrast, a way to make the enlightened man feel superior. By creating a monster called the Middle Ages, the modern world crowned itself saint. Soon, other showmen followed. Traveling exhibitions across Germany and France displayed fake torture devices beside wax figures of monks and inquisitors. Visitors gasped, shuddered, and felt grateful to be born in a more humane century. No one asked for evidence. The horror was too satisfying. The Iron Maiden became proof that civilization had advanced. Newspapers helped, too. In London, sensational pamphlets described the dreadful German invention of the Iron Virgin. Illustrations showed steel spikes dripping with imaginary blood. Readers devoured it. The same presses that printed Newton's physics and Voltaire's essays also printed tales of dismemberment. Rational thought and theatrical cruelty were two sides of the same coin. Even museums joined in. When the first authentic Iron Maiden went on display in the early 1800s, curators didn't question its origin. They built narratives around it. Placards described how it punished blasphemers, adulterers, and heretics. School children were marched past it as a warning against moral decay. History became spectacle. Fear became education. There was money in terror. The more grotesque the exhibit, the bigger the crowds. Iron Maidens multiplied across Europe, each claiming to be the original. One in Nuremberg, one in Vienna, one in London. Some had hinges so old they could barely move. Others were freshly welded in local forges. Authenticity didn't matter. The myth was the commodity. But behind the entertainment lay something darker, a cultural cleansing through storytelling. By casting the Middle Ages as an age of torture and faith run mad, the Enlightenment quietly excused its own cruelties, colonial conquest, slavery, and public executions that filled modern newspapers. It was easier to pity the imagined victims of the past than to face the real victims of the present. The Iron Maiden became a political weapon. Protestant writers used it to attack the Catholic Church. Atheists used it to mock religion itself. Revolutionaries used it to condemn monarchy. Each side reshaped the myth to suit its moral campaign. The smiling Iron Woman was no longer just a machine of spikes. She was a mirror held up to whatever enemy you chose. Think of how powerful that image must have been. A beautiful face that kills. A body shaped like mercy hiding needles of judgment. It said everything about hypocrisy, about the corruption of ideals. It was the perfect metaphor for every regime that preached virtue while practicing violence. And yet, even as they used it as a symbol, people believed it was real. Because believing in the Iron Maiden made them feel enlightened. Believing in barbarism confirmed their own civilization. That's the terrible genius of Enlightenment horror. It teaches you to fear the darkness, so you never notice the shadows cast by your own light. By the late 19th century, the myth was unstoppable. Victorian scholars cataloged torture devices with the same precision they applied to fossils. Pain became history, sanitized and cataloged. The Iron Maiden was no longer a warning. It was entertainment for the drawing room. But the age of exhibitions would not be the last place she appeared. The Iron Maiden was about to step off her museum pedestal and enter a new kind of theater, one where propaganda would no longer just rewrite history, but reenact it. Because in the next century, the smiling coffin would open again, and this time, real blood would follow. By the dawn of the 19th century, the Iron Maiden had transcended myth. It had become a brand. A symbol sold, replicated, and repurposed across Europe and beyond. But what began as a fabricated artifact of faith would soon become something much more profitable: a political tool, a cultural weapon, and a business built on human fascination with pain. The church, the state, and the showman, three forces that had always competed for control of the human soul, suddenly found themselves in quiet collaboration. Each realized that fear was currency, and nothing sold fear like the promise of salvation from it. Museums of Christian cruelty popped up in Protestant Germany and England, where preachers used the Iron Maiden to prove the wickedness of Catholic superstition. Look, they would say, at what happens when faith loses reason. Crowds would nod, grateful that they lived in a more enlightened age, never noticing that they were being manipulated by the very same emotional theater that once filled medieval cathedrals. Meanwhile, Catholic nations fired back with their own spectacles, collections of pagan torture devices, used, they claimed, by heretics and atheists. Everyone had their version of history's monsters, and everyone's monster conveniently looked like their opponent. It wasn't just religion. Governments used it too. In newly industrialized Europe, where cities swelled and revolutions simmered, the Iron Maiden became propaganda for social order. Newspapers reminded the public that law and monarchy had freed them from the savagery of the past. In the shadow of the guillotine and the gallows, the Iron Maiden whispered a simple message: "You are safe now. The monsters are gone. The system works." But that message was a lie. Public executions still drew cheering crowds. Prisons overflowed with the poor, and colonies abroad became laboratories of suffering far beyond anything a medieval dungeon could imagine. The difference was only aesthetic. Now the cruelty was hidden behind language, bureaucracy, and progress. The Iron Maiden had moved from the dungeon to the museum, from the hands of executioners to the minds of politicians. Pain was no longer punishment, it was persuasion. And then came the entertainers, the businessmen of horror. In London's Westminster, waxworks and freak shows began displaying real medieval torture instruments. They charged a penny a head for entry, and more for the privilege of touching the Iron Maiden spikes. Some shows even hired actors to scream from within, their cries echoing through hidden tubes to give visitors an authentic experience. Families came on Sunday afternoons. Children cried. Adults laughed nervously and whispered prayers. The Iron Maiden had become theater, sin as spectacle, morality as merchandise. By the late Victorian era, she was everywhere, in penny dreadfuls, lithographs, carnival posters. A symbol of both horror and titillation. The church denounced her. The public adored her. And behind the moral outrage, someone was always collecting the coins at the door. That's the unsettling truth about cruelty. It doesn't disappear when society condemns it. It simply changes its marketing. The same device once used to frighten heretics into obedience now frightened audiences into buying tickets, newspapers, and souvenirs. Each new retelling made her spike sharper, her smile sweeter, her legend more profitable. The Iron Maiden became a mirror not just of pain, but of commerce, proof that humanity would always pay to watch suffering, as long as it was framed as history. Even museums joined the circus. Curators realized that morality exhibits drew more visitors than art. The British Museum proudly displayed the Nuremberg Iron Maiden, while smaller galleries crafted their own versions, each claiming authenticity. Tour guides told the same embellished story. Victims were shut inside, the doors closed, and the spikes slowly entered their flesh. The crowds leaned in closer. They wanted to hear every detail. Fear had become leisure. And in that moment, amid the laughter, the gasps, the clicking coins, the Iron Maiden fulfilled her true purpose. Not to torture, but to perform. Not to punish the wicked, but to entertain the righteous. She didn't just represent cruelty, she normalized it. She made it beautiful. She made it safe. She made it profitable. And yet, beneath the polished brass plaques and candlelit exhibits, a darker truth lingered. The myth was already seeping back into reality. Governments, police states, and armies of the coming century would soon rediscover what the Iron Maiden had taught so well. That pain, properly staged, is the most powerful propaganda of all. For all the terror that the Iron Maiden inspired in the imagination of modern audiences, the truth is that the real tortures of the medieval world were far more brutal, more intimate, and more inventive than the myth could ever capture. If the Iron Maiden was fear distilled into art, the real instruments of pain were fear made practical, engineered not for symbolism, but for results. Picture the breaking wheel, an enormous spoked circle laid flat like a cross between a weapon and a stage. The condemned would be tied to it, limbs outstretched, while an executioner methodically shattered bones with an iron bar. One strike per joint, careful, measured, deliberate. It wasn't just a killing, it was choreography. The crowd could see each fracture, hear each crack echo through the square. The broken body would then be woven through the wheel's spokes and hoisted upright, a grotesque trophy left to die under the open sky. Days later, birds would finish what the executioner began. Then there was the strappato, deceptively simple, a rope tied to the wrists, looped over a beam, then yanked until shoulders dislocated with an audible pop. No spikes, no blood, just the slow, excruciating pull of your own body, weight tearing your joints apart. The church favored this one. It left no visible wounds, preserving the illusion of moral purity. You could confess, be absolved, and still hanged by your wrists in the name of God. Or the Judas cradle, a pyramid of polished wood, its point rising like a cruel altar. The victim was lowered onto it by ropes, the sharp tip forced into the most vulnerable place a body possesses. The torture wasn't in the initial pain, but in the patience. Gravity did the rest, inch by inch, until mercy came in the form of infection or exhaustion. And yet, none of these horrors carried the strange, almost theatrical beauty that the Iron Maiden myth did. There were no sculpted faces, no symbolic smiles. The real instruments of torture were not elegant. They were filthy, improvised, and mechanical. They smelled of sweat, urine, iron, and fear. Their victims weren't heretics in elegant gowns or condemned nobles whispering final prayers. They were peasants, beggars, deserters, thieves, people whose deaths were not stories, but statistics. The true cruelty of the Middle Ages wasn't in the devices. It was in the indifference. Executions were public entertainment. Children ate fruit while watching men burn. Vendors sold pies and ale beneath the gallows. When the pyre's smoke curled into the sky, townsfolk cheered not because they were evil, but because they were numb. To them, suffering was as ordinary as weather. The Iron Maiden myth, with its clean metallic edges and tragic beauty, made torture seem distant, ceremonial, almost noble. It transformed chaos into morality play. The reality was messy, dull, and repetitive, people dying not from artful pain, but from bureaucracy and boredom. That's the part that makes it worse. When cruelty becomes routine, it stops being monstrous. It becomes normal. Modern historians have uncovered letters from executioners complaining about fatigue, about the smell of the burning fat, about the boredom of waiting for victims to die. Torture was a job, not a ritual. And when violence becomes labor, humanity collapses into procedure. No invention, no myth could match that quiet horror. So why did people prefer to believe in the Iron Maiden? Because she made cruelty poetic. She gave horror a face, a story, a symmetry. The real wheel, the real rack, the real flames, those were too shapeless to comprehend. The Iron Maiden gave pain boundaries, rules, and meaning. She turned the chaos of history into something beautiful enough to look at. That's the paradox of human psychology. We can face horror only when it's filtered through fiction. The fake becomes the only way we can tolerate the real. When museum visitors stared at the Iron Maiden's hollow eyes, they weren't recoiling from medieval violence. They were consuming it safely, repackaged for modern taste. The spikes were metaphors. The smile was a screen. And yet, the fascination with those iron doors revealed a deeper truth about us. That civilization's relationship with cruelty never ended. It just changed its tools. The whip became the prison cell. The pyre became the propaganda reel. And the Iron Maiden's smile lived on, not in dungeons, but in every system that justifies suffering as order, punishment, or progress. Because, in the end, the Iron Maiden was never the point. She was a mask, an invention that let the modern world pretend it had conquered barbarity while quietly perfecting it. The real tortures were worse, but they had no name, no legend, no artistry. They left no smiling face to warn us what we had become. By the time Europe plunged into the darkness of the 20th century, the Iron Maiden had already been dismissed by most historians as a myth, a theatrical exaggeration born from the fantasies of Enlightenment showmen. But myths have a strange way of surviving. They linger in the collective imagination, waiting for a new monster to find a use for them. And in the 1930s, that monster arrived. When Adolf Hitler rose to power, the Nazi regime became obsessed with symbols of strength, purity, and fear. Everything from architecture to uniforms was designed to intimidate. Power was performance, terror was theater, and propaganda was the stage. Somewhere inside that stage, the Iron Maiden, that smiling relic of imagined cruelty, found a new role. In the early years of the regime, a replica Iron Maiden stood in the German city of Nuremberg, the same city where the myth had first been born. Tourists could visit it in a small museum exhibit. It was supposed to be a curiosity, a relic of the barbaric Dark Ages. But under Nazi control, Nuremberg became more than just another city. It became the beating heart of Hitler's ideological empire, the site of mass rallies, racial laws, and spectacle. The Iron Maiden was no longer a cautionary symbol. It was now part of the aesthetic of power. Eyewitness accounts from Allied soldiers after the war claimed that a version of the Iron Maiden had been discovered in the Dachau concentration camp, allegedly used by the Gestapo as an interrogation device. They described blood on the spikes, the faint smell of rust and decay, and the imprint of bodies against steel. For decades, this claim was repeated in books, newspapers, and documentaries. The Nazis, they said, had resurrected the Iron Maiden. But when historians began to dig deeper, they found something far more complex and more disturbing. There is no concrete evidence that the Gestapo used the Iron Maiden in their interrogations. No official records, no surviving photographs, no testimonies from guards confirming its operation. Most likely, the object found at Dachau was an old museum replica repurposed for intimidation. A prop of fear, not a functioning weapon. But that distinction hardly matters, because even if it wasn't used, it was believed. And belief, in the hands of a regime built on propaganda, was enough. The Nazis understood something fundamental about the psychology of terror. The imagination always tortures harder than the body. A man shown the Iron Maiden didn't need to be locked inside to feel pain. The sight of it, the cold glint of spikes, the shadow of its face, was enough to break him. The mind could finish the rest. In that sense, the Nazis didn't resurrect a myth. They perfected it. It's chilling to think about a machine that likely never existed in the Middle Ages becoming part of the real machinery of the modern age's most efficient killing state. A myth forged to condemn religious cruelty was reborn to serve political cruelty. The Enlightenment's propaganda had come full circle. Nuremberg, where Siebenke's once invented the Iron Maiden for spectacle, became the site of Nazi rallies that turned horror into public theater on an unimaginable scale. Tens of thousands gathered to chant in unison under the symbol of the swastika, a different kind of Iron Maiden, forged not from steel, but from obedience. And when the war ended, Nuremberg became again a theater of punishment, the site of the trials that exposed the machinery of genocide to the world. In that same city, inside its museum of horrors, the Iron Maiden still stood, a relic of an older lie now surrounded by the debris of a new one. After the trials, Allied journalists photographed the Iron Maiden of Nuremberg and wrote that it had been used by the Nazis. The story spread quickly, printed in newspapers from London to New York. The myth had mutated again, from medieval terror to Enlightenment propaganda to modern atrocity. It didn't matter that historians couldn't prove its use. The world needed symbols. The Iron Maiden became the perfect one. It gave shape to the unspeakable. It made industrialized evil look ancient, inevitable, almost mythical, as if the cruelty of the past had simply evolved rather than been reborn by choice. Even decades later, visitors to Dachau whispered about the spike coffin once used there. Tour guides told the story as fact. The image stuck. The serene iron face smiling through centuries, from medieval dungeons to concentration camps. Her spikes rusted, but her purpose eternal. The irony is staggering. A lie created to prove how barbaric the past had been was resurrected to show how barbaric the present had become. And once again, humanity learned the same lesson it keeps forgetting, that the line between myth and history is thin, and that the myths we invent to condemn cruelty can just as easily be used to justify it. By the mid-20th century, the Iron Maiden was no longer just a museum curiosity. She was a metaphor carved into global consciousness, proof that fear, once created, never truly dies. The smiling coffin had survived wars, revolutions, and centuries of disbelief. She had crossed from fiction into faith, from story into system. And like every myth that endures, she did so because she told a truth people didn't want to face. That cruelty isn't medieval. It's human. What makes us dare? Why do we freeze when confronted with suffering, unable to look away, even as every instinct tells us to turn? The answer lies in something older than civilization itself, the strange bond between pain and fascination. The Iron Maiden, whether as myth or symbol, exists precisely because of that paradox. She represents humanity's most unsettling instinct, our need to witness cruelty, to remind ourselves that we are not its victims. We don't only fear pain, we consume it. We dress it in ritual, disguise it as justice, and call it history. Modern science has a name for this reflex. Neuroscientists call it vicarious trauma, the brain's ability to experience another's pain as if it were its own. When we see someone suffer, our pain receptors activate in sympathy. The mirror neurons in our brain fire, reflecting agony we haven't felt. But here's the twist. The same mechanism that breeds empathy also fuels voyeurism. The moment we realize the pain isn't ours, another emotion surfaces. Relief. Relief that becomes fascination. Fascination that becomes entertainment. It's the same reason crowds once gathered to watch public executions. The same reason medieval townspeople bought sweet cakes while men burned at the stake. The same reason millions today stop scrolling when they see an image of disaster, violence, or outrage. The Iron Maiden hasn't disappeared. She's been digitized. Psychologists say that fear viewed from safety releases dopamine, a chemical hit, like a drug. It's the body's way of celebrating survival. That's why horror movies thrive, why true crime podcasts dominate, why headlines scream about violence we can't prevent but can't ignore. Every click, every view, every replay of another person's suffering is a whisper from the same ancient instinct that once drew crowds to the scaffold. We watch, we recoil, we click again. The Enlightenment thinkers who built the myth of the Iron Maiden understood this instinct before science gave it a name. They turned torture into a morality show, a safe place to experience fear without consequence. You could shudder at the cruelty of your ancestors while feeling secure in your own enlightenment. It was pain turned into proof of progress. The same psychology drives modern spectacle. When we watch documentaries about serial killers or atrocities, we aren't confronting evil. We're measuring our distance from it. The Iron Maiden smiles because she knows we still need her. Philosophers like Michel Foucault argued that the disappearance of public torture didn't end society's obsession with punishment. It simply made it invisible. We replaced the scaffold with the prison cell, the executioner with the bureaucrat, the scream with the report. But the spectacle remains. We still demand to see power enacted on the body. Only now it comes to us filtered through screens, narrations, and simulations. Think about it. The same Enlightenment world that invented the Iron Maiden myth also birthed the panopticon, the prison design that allows one guard to see every inmate without being seen himself. Visibility became the new method of control. The Iron Maiden was an illusion of torture. The panopticon was torture turned into architecture. Both made fear permanent, one through imagination, the other through surveillance. When you imagine the Iron Maiden closing, spikes hovering inches from skin, the terror isn't in the pain, it's in the anticipation. The human mind suffers most not from what is happening, but from what might happen. That's why the myth worked so well. It left space for imagination to finish the job. Every scream echoed louder in the mind than in the world. Even today, every viral image of tragedy, every video shared with the caption "Viewer discretion advised," follows the same blueprint. We tell ourselves we're watching to understand, to stay informed, to never forget. But deep down, we're feeding the same ancient hunger, to look into the abyss while staying safely on its edge. There's a term used in media psychology, compassion fatigue. It describes the moment when constant exposure to suffering no longer shocks us, it numbs us. The first time we see a body, we flinch. The 10th time, we analyze the camera angle. The 100th time, we scroll past it without feeling anything at all. And that is when the Iron Maiden smiles again, because indifference is her final victory. When the Nazi guards posed for photographs outside concentration camps, or when war journalists captured images of the dying, the same moral question resurfaced. Where is the line between witnessing and consuming? Between remembering and indulging? Between empathy and appetite? The Iron Maiden was never a real machine, but she revealed a very real equation. The more aesthetic the pain, the easier it is to justify watching. Science confirms what history has always known. Fear can be conditioned, compassion can be dulled, and spectacle can become a weapon. The Iron Maiden's genius wasn't mechanical engineering. It was psychological engineering. She taught societies how to moralize pain while secretly craving it. She proved that you can control people not only through what they suffer, but through what they see. In that sense, every age has built its own Iron Maiden. The Inquisition had its dungeons. The Enlightenment had its exhibitions. The modern world has its media. The faces change, the materials evolve, but the principle remains eternal. Pain, when packaged correctly, becomes power. The Iron Maiden didn't just survive history, she adapted to it. And in the soft blue glow of our screens, her smile has never looked more familiar. For a machine that never truly existed, the Iron Maiden has lived more lives than any real artifact of the Middle Ages. When history gave up on her, fiction adopted her. When scholars debunked her, artists resurrected her. And when the world finally forgot what she was meant to symbolize, pop culture gave her a new purpose, as an icon of rebellion, darkness, and spectacle. The first resurrection came quietly. In the 19th century, when museums began retiring their gruesome torture exhibits, painters and writers kept her alive. She appeared in penny dreadfuls, Gothic novels, and serialized melodramas. The Iron Virgin, who whispered from dungeons and haunted cathedrals. She became a muse for writers obsessed with beauty and decay, like Edgar Allan Poe, who turned slow, mechanical death into poetry. Even when her name wasn't spoken, her spirit lingered in every iron gate, every chamber of echoes, every coffin-shaped silhouette lit by candlelight. Then came the 20th century, the age of cinema. If the Enlightenment made the Iron Maiden believable, Hollywood made her beautiful. Directors rediscovered her curves, her symmetry, her twisted serenity. In early horror films and pulp posters, she returned as both executioner and victim, the silent metal woman whose embrace meant doom. She was no longer an instrument of faith or politics. She was the aesthetic of fear itself. By the time the British heavy metal band Iron Maiden formed in the late 1970s, the transformation was complete. The myth had become a brand, the brand a badge. What once stood for religious cruelty now stood for rebellion, for the thrill of breaking taboos. Teenagers wore her name on their backs not because they feared her, but because they identified with her. She was everything polite society told them not to be. Loud, dark, defiant, immortal. That's the strange alchemy of myth. Given enough time, even terror becomes fashion. The spikes become logos. The screams become guitar riffs. The coffin becomes a stage. Every concert poster, every album cover bearing her name turned her legend inside out, from symbol of oppression to emblem of freedom. The same machine once used to condemn humanity's cruelty now celebrated its refusal to be tamed. But beneath the distortion and lights, the old meaning still flickers like a warning. Because the Iron Maiden story was never really about medieval torture. It was about the human mind's endless capacity to redecorate cruelty, to dress it up, rename it, remix it, and call it something noble. We once justified pain as purification. Then we displayed it as education. Now we consume it as entertainment. Each version feels modern. Each version feels civilized. And each one wears the same smile. Museums still keep replicas behind glass, labeled artifact of disputed authenticity. Tourists take photos beside them, grinning. They post captions like the scariest thing I've ever seen. And just like that, the Iron Maiden survives, no longer through blood, but through pixels. The same object once accused of killing in the name of faith now lives forever in the name of content. In that sense, her immortality is perfect. She no longer needs victims. She just needs viewers. Every time her image flashes across a screen, every time someone whispers her name in a haunted attraction, every time she is invoked as a symbol of the old barbarism, she feeds. Not on bodies, but on belief. Not on screams, but on clicks. The afterlife of the Iron Maiden is proof that fear doesn't die. It mutates. Each generation reinvents her to reflect its own anxieties. For the Enlightenment, she was superstition. For the Nazis, she was intimidation. For the modern world, she is nostalgia, a comforting nightmare, a reminder that our monsters used to be simpler. But if you look closely at her, you realize she has changed less than we think. She still promises intimacy and destruction in the same breath. She still disguises death behind a human face. She still stands for every system that claims to protect you while quietly consuming you. The Iron Maiden has outlived her myth because she was never just metal and spikes. She was an idea that control and compassion can coexist, that pain can be sanctified, that horror can be beautiful. An idea so seductive that we rebuilt her again and again in politics, in media, in technology. Every algorithm that keeps us watching suffering, every government that sells fear for obedience, every industry that packages misery as entertainment, they all wear her smile. And so even now she endures, not in the shadows of a dungeon, but in the reflections on our screens. The face is smoother. The spikes are invisible. But she's still there, waiting for us to step closer, to look, to stare, to believe. She still smiles. That same faint, knowing smile, neither cruel nor kind. The smile that has outlived every age that claimed to bury her. In the beginning, it was only iron. Now it's everywhere, in the headlines, in the algorithms, in the way we watch and the way we forget. The Iron Maiden no longer stands in a dungeon. She stands inside the human psyche. When you think about it, that was her purpose all along. To show us that civilization doesn't erase cruelty, it refines it. We no longer close doors lined with spikes. We open screens lined with images. We no longer build cages for bodies. We build them for attention. The screams are quieter now, but the silence they leave behind is deafening. History tells us that the Iron Maiden was a lie, a fabrication. And yet, she feels more real than ever. Because what she represents has never gone away. Our obsession with pain, our need to moralize suffering, our addiction to the theater of control. She taught us that power doesn't need to draw blood to work. It only needs to make us watch. And we have been watching ever since. In her first life, she was a tourist attraction. In her second, she became propaganda. In her third, she turned into legend. And in this one, ours, she has become reflection. We look at her and see the distance between the past and the present collapse into nothing. We look at her and see how easily we mistake horror for history and history for progress. The truth is that every age has its Iron Maiden. Ours just hides behind compassion. We say we watch tragedy to raise awareness. We share horror to learn. We dissect cruelty to understand. But somewhere inside, a darker instinct still whispers, look closer. The more we stare, the more her smile widens. Maybe that's why her myth refused to die, because it wasn't about her at all. It was about us, about the part of the human condition that can't resist turning pain into performance, morality into marketing, and fear into fascination. Every generation condemns the barbarism of the last, unaware that it's building its own version, shinier and more efficient. The Iron Maiden was never just a coffin of spikes. She was a promise that we could be better, and a reminder that we never are. So yes, the historians are right. There was never a real Iron Maiden in the medieval age. But there have been thousands since, each one shaped by the hands of those who believe they're beyond cruelty. Each one waiting for its next willing victim to step inside. And maybe, just maybe, that victim isn't someone else. Maybe it's us. Every time we choose comfort over truth, spectacle over empathy, illusion over understanding. Maybe every click, every view, every story we consume about another's suffering tightens those iron doors just a little more. So, if you ever find yourself in a museum, standing before her, the Iron Maiden, with her calm, eternal smile, don't look at her as a relic of a brutal past. Look at her as a mirror. Because what stares back through those hollow eyes isn't history. It's the reflection of a species still learning how to be human. And until that lesson is learned, the Iron Maiden will never really close. She'll just keep smiling,